and get to our fourth agenda item, sub-item B, Regional Housing Needs Allocation Plan. Staff, Betty Weiss,
yes,
going to give the presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Myers and Planning Commission. I'm here actually to make just a few introductory remarks. The presentation today will be made by Mike Powers from the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, and we are talking about the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. I just wanted to provide a little bit of background comments for the Planning Commission in terms of the city's participation in the RHNA process, and in particular, at this time, there is quite a bit of discussion going on with the Technical Planning Advisory Committee, and you'll hear about that group as part of Mr. Powers' presentation. The Technical Planning Advisory Committee, or TPAC, has a full representation of staff throughout the county, including the unincorporated county planning staff and representation from all the cities within the county. Our city representation is led by Liz Limon, who has been a member of the TPAC for many years. In fact, she was the chair of the TPAC in the last RHNA review process. So we're lucky to have someone who has as much background on city policy with respect to growth issues. This regional housing needs assessment is a regional planning study and outcome, and the group last night, TPAC, met in the Board of Supervisors room and was really talking about just getting their hands around the fact that this is a regional planning process, yet each agency brings into the whole mix the policy framework and directives from the various local agencies. And for the city of Santa Barbara, some of the key points that we have built into the system in the city that we share into the RHNA process are the Measure E growth management, non-residential growth management program the city has, as well as our existing certified housing element and prior housing elements as well, with the build-out assumptions of the 40,005 dwelling units and the overall 3 million square feet of non-residential growth over the 20-year period of Measure E. Again, during the general plan update, as we call it, from the late 1980s, early 90s, there was quite a bit of discussion within our community about the history of Santa Barbara as the and its present state as the county seat and the major regional employment center for a number of facilities, such as county government, local city government, the court system. Of course, we have the regional health facility of the Cottage Hospital. This is has been a financial center for the county for quite some time, and there is quite a bit of course, industry in terms of the tourist industry and all its related components. So what we found certainly in the city of Santa Barbara is over time a history where with that much activity and job and economic stimulus, the housing needs for this region are not just met within the boundaries of the city of Santa Barbara city limits, and that when the general plan update took place, the focus really was on looking at increments of growth. And when you consider, the Planning Commission considers approval of any non-residential development where charter section findings are required, we make the finding that there's no significant unmitigated impact to affordable housing. That is an effort to balance our non-residential development and our housing for the increment of growth that was approved in the charter section, that 3 million square feet. We do not pretend to be solving the imbalance situation that has grown over time, where again the number of jobs and economy that is within the city of Santa Barbara is not really fully housed within the city of Santa Barbara. But that is not to say that we shy away from that. When you look at the policies and directives of the city's housing element, any effort to bring that situation more into balance, to encourage workforce housing and a diverse housing stock and population is clearly a major important city goal. So when Mr. Powers goes through and starts talking about factors, about how do you weight and consider existing jobs, future job growth, existing housing, and future housing growth, we at the city come at it from this basis of our general plan and charter policies. And so that's what we've been bringing into the discussion while we are participating in a regional dialogue. So it's very important that people understand that in the regional housing need assessment, you do need to take a step back and not only be, it's not a turf. It's not just all about your own particular policies or just looking at what's the number for the city of Santa Barbara alone. We really need to look at the region as a whole as well as the different sub-regions. And so cooperation is definitely a key. Again, I was impressed with the discussion that the TPAC was having last night where the staff from SBCAG presented quite a bit of information from other association of governments and looking at how this process progresses throughout the state. Of course, each region has its own particulars, but there is certainly something we can learn from other organizations. So we look forward to your general comments today, and to the degree that we can answer any questions, so certainly would like to help move the discussion along. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Powers.
Mr. Powers, welcome. Could you give me an idea about how long your presentation is?
Interactively, it usually works out to be about an hour with questions and answers and the like.
Okay.
I can expedite it to your direction.
Well, I just want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions from the commission, so thank you.
And my style is that as questions come up, just ask away, and if it's going to be dealt with later, I'll indicate such.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm here to talk about the regional housing needs allocation process. The outline is to provide a brief overview of our agency, the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, indicate the process by which the statewide housing need is allocated to jurisdictions like Santa Barbara County, to address the strategy of SBCAG and looking at the housing allocation process, to discuss the schedule, review allocation factors, and identify where we're at now, because we're at the beginning of this process. Oops, I hit the wrong button. Thank you. The arrow's best, very good. As you probably already know, the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments is a 13-member body of elected officials, which consists of 8 cities and the County Board of Supervisors, a mayor or council person. Mayor Bloom is your representative on SBCAG. We're required by state and federal law to conduct comprehensive regional transportation planning and programming, and we're assigned other responsibilities by the state legislature, one of which is the regional housing needs allocation process. It begins by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, a division of business housing and transportation within the state of California that determines the housing need for each region. Councils of governments, like ourselves, are allocated shares of the region's housing need to then cities and the county. We're one of a number of regions throughout the state who are assigned shares from HCD. We then allocate that countywide share to cities and the county, and then local agencies prepare housing elements, and the regional housing needs allocation is one of a number of elements within that housing element process. Other factors being the nature of the housing stock, those units requiring rehabilitation, overcrowding, a number of other issues of which the RHNA is just but one. We're required to allocate housing needs as it's an element of the state housing element law. It addresses issues related to overall growth and change in population, demographic, economic factors that drive growth and change throughout the state and the county. We're obligated to address the housing needs of all economic segments of the community and to specifically address the relationship between jobs and housing within communities. And we're obligated to allocate housing need by income group and with a specific direction to avoid concentration of low-income groups within communities. It's a top-down approach in which the housing need is estimated by the State Department of Housing and Community Development and then assigned to council governments like ourselves. The final allocation to our county is 11,600 units for the 2007 to 2014 planning period. Local governments must then zone land to meet their housing allocation within the housing element process. However, you're not responsible for ensuring that the housing is constructed. You are responsible to provide opportunities so that it might be constructed. The process by which our housing need was allocated began on July 30th, in which the Department of Housing and Community Development assigned us a 13,112 allocation. This is quite reduced from the prior cycle. Back in 2002, for that planning period, we were assigned a 17,531 unit allocation. We, as staff, provided some objections to some of the initial factors that were used by HCD. They lowered our allocation to 12,453. We were still dissatisfied, and we engaged in a consultation process by which a subcommittee of our board met with the director of HCD and her senior staff. And as a result of that consultation, they further reduced our number slightly and provided us with an allocation of 11,600 units. I must indicate also that we were the only regional agency in the state of California that provided any objection to its allocation, so it was somewhat unusual within the state of California. The countywide housing unit allocation, the 11,600 units, is also by income level. Income is generally a product of the U.S. Census that occurs on a decennial basis. And since we haven't had a census since 2000, we are obligated to use an HCD provided the income distribution based on the year 2000 census. Can our county theoretically accommodate the housing allocation? The answer is yes. If we look at the countywide theoretical build-out, if we take all the local plans of all the cities in the unincorporated area and add them up, there's a potential build-out of residential units of 31,000 units. This number has proven to be quite a target within our public outreach process because there's a lot of flux to this number. It doesn't, reflect the topographic constraints of individual parcels that may be impacted by build-out. It doesn't reflect density bonus options, things like that. So it's a theoretical number, but nonetheless it's reflective of the best estimates of local agencies in terms of the build-out of their local land use plans. The strategy in developing a regional housing needs plan is that our board, the Association of Governments, decided to accept the final countywide allocation of 11,600 units and then move on to the allocation to local agencies. Their direction was to involve the cities in the county, local planners, and public workshops as a way to develop that process. As Ms. Weiss indicated, we use local planners as our steering committee, the Technical Planning Advisory Committee, of which the city is well represented. And then we're obligated to address prescribed allocation factors in the state law and selective factors that best fit our situation. There's also a formal review process built into the regional housing needs allocation statute within the housing element law that provides for formal review by the cities in the county. Does the new RHNA allocation replace the prior allocation? In the case of Santa Barbara City, the answer is yes, and most jurisdictions within the county of Santa Barbara. The new RHNA estimate covers a new planning period, and the new allocation replaces the allocation from the prior period. We have two situations, Goleta and the county of Santa Barbara, that have not yet certified their housing elements from the prior planning period. And to the extent that they don't complete their rezonings or the like, they may have some carryover from the prior cycle. This is illustrated in this graphic. For example, if a jurisdiction was assigned an allocation of 2,500 units and they did not complete all their adequate sites requirements as part of their certification process, say, for example, 200 units, and for this next cycle they were assigned 1,500 units, their obligation would be the 1,500 plus the 200 unmet adequate sites requirement through prior requirement. In this case, this carryover does not apply to Santa Barbara because it has a certified housing element, but it may apply to 2 other jurisdictions. The geography we're addressing in this process consists of the County of Santa Barbara and the 8 cities, the unincorporated county regions. Traditionally, we have looked at housing market areas because there's a lot of interchange between incorporated and unincorporated areas within defined regions. There is a challenge of addressing factors that tie in adjoining counties, both within the Santa Maria area and certainly the South Coast. There's interchange with our adjoining counties, San Luis Obispo and Ventura, but they are within other RENA regions, and there's a wall between us for purposes of the regional housing needs allocation. We can't assign housing need to those regions, and likewise they can't assign it to ours. In terms of the timeline, we started in November when the board accepted the regional housing needs allocation. Since then and now, we're developing the RENA allocation methodology in conjunction with our Planning Advisory Committee. In February, March, depending on how things go, we'll have our board review of the draft allocation methodology, and there's a 60-day review period in which we would have a board hearing on that process either in March or April. We would then at some point have our board approve and release the methodology and the draft plan. Some of the other factors that would be included besides the allocation methodology and would be, for example, policies related to annexations, what happens to your allocation when you're faced with annexations of territory. There's a formal review process then that by which local agencies and the public could review the plan. We would then, as the agency, SBCAG would entertain any requests for revisions to the plan, hold a hearing, and then after that decision, yet there's another appeal process. So given all the timelines that are established in statute, we would expect that we could wrap this up by August, which is when we're supposed to do it, to enable you as a city and all the cities in the county to then initiate any updates to their housing element, looking at some of the other factors I mentioned earlier. At the end, even HCD has another 60-day review period, so there's plenty of opportunity for review and comment upon this process. I mentioned allocation factors. State law requires the development of the regional housing needs assessment to address a series of factors. They're listed here, but I have them specified individually, so I'll skip to the next couple of slides and I'll come back to the factors themselves. The factors are used to allocate housing need to local agencies. We basically use a spreadsheet allocation model that enables us to add factors, subtract them if necessary, and provide some weighting. We can develop alternative and scenarios associated with our emphasis on various factors. That's kind of where we're at right now. They're most useful if they're available for all agencies, because we have to allocate our housing need to cities in the unincorporated area, ranging from the smaller community of Guadalupe in the north to the city of Santa Barbara and the unincorporated total area as well. It's better if the factors are adjustable and can account for weighting for multiple factors, and then of course simpler is better. Questions for you to consider as we go through the individual factors. What factors do you believe should be considered of the ones that are listed? What information sources might we consider, and what factors do you believe are the most important? So you might choose a number of factors, but what do you think are the most important, and how should we weight them in our evaluation? Factor one is the local agency existing and projected jobs and housing relationship. This is a factor that's actually identified dealing with the objectives of the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. So the relationship between jobs and housing is a critical factor for us to consider. Part of this we evaluated within the development of our regional growth forecast that was just this last year updated in 2007. There are a series of local agency opportunities and constraints that we might consider. Looking at the availability of land suitable for urban development. We have general estimates of land by local jurisdiction, federal or state protected land such as Los Padres forests, county policies to preserve prime agricultural land, availability of sewer or water service from the perspective of whether or not service can or cannot be provided based upon state or federal regulations that inhibit housing development. Availability for conversion to residential use. There are some aspects of the factors that are specified that suggest we even can provide alternative scenarios under alternative zoning. Now, I have to apprise you of the fact that our board is very reluctant about getting into local land use planning, as you might surmise. And so our ability to explore some of these variations about alternative land uses are probably limited by their concerns about regional agencies getting involved too much into local land use issues. Factors 3 and 4 deal with growth distribution for our transportation plan and general market demand for housing. Some of these factors are looked at our growth forecast in terms of overall demand for housing and distribution. We have a transportation model that enables us to look at some of the transportation factors if we choose to do that. In fact, I'll talk about one we looked at. Agreements between city and county regarding growth area targeting. There are some jurisdictions in the state that have agreements between city and county about potential for growth and the location of that growth. Loss of assisted housing units. We've looked at that, and that's not really a significant issue within our county. High housing cost burdens. If you listen to the residents and technical staff throughout the county, you find this is a county-wide issue, not just unique to the South Coast. But even though relative costs might be less in North County, that's still an issue. And then housing needs of farm workers are another issue. Housing needs due to a private university, Cal State or UC campus. So in this case, Westmont College and UCSB might count, but unfortunately community colleges are not singled out as this factor. And then a generic other. One example that we point to that could be considered is when the grand jury issued its report last year on affordable housing and RENA, they suggested that housing production performance should be accounted for as part of an allocation factor. So that's an example of another factor that might be considered. We've held public workshops to gain input on the allocation criteria. We've given a similar presentation in those workshops and try to engage people's interest in identification of what factors they think are important and what should we consider. So we've held those around the county on those dates. The input we've got, besides no where, no how, no way, which is not unique to any one specific area, but occurs throughout in terms of concerns about the state telling us what to do and what are they messing in our business for and all that. We certainly heard that at each location, but generally the overriding comment that we heard in each workshop was to look carefully at the relationship between jobs and housing and use that as an important allocation criteria, both in the context of the existing situation but also projected growth. The Technical Planning Advisory Group also wanted us to look more carefully about what other councils, governments like ourselves are doing in this area, and then to take the input we got and prepare and to identify alternative scenarios. Here's a slide that illustrates what some of the other councils and governments are doing. I mentioned that we're on different review cycles, so the larger agencies like the Bay Area and the Southern California Association of Governments are pretty much already done. whereas agencies like ourselves and San Luis Obispo Council are in preparation, have just received their allocation over the last few months. There's a general connection between some of the larger agencies and what is called a blueprint partnership planning process. They've been engaged in this process for couple, 3 years. It's involved a substantial amount of community outreach and visioning, growth visioning, focusing on things like transit-oriented development, trying to really focus on those types of issues. We have not engaged in that process ourselves, so a lot of the impacts, say, on forecast housing that they would have accounted for really reflects a lot of that region-wide involvement, community involvement in growth planning, and more involvement of the regional agency in local land use planning, something our board is very reluctant to engage in. But this gives you a sense of what some of the factors are. Jobs housing is important in other areas as well. And then, for example, the Bay Area looked at household and employment growth near transit, trying to foster housing allocations to areas that are more transit sensitive. The scenarios that we've looked at to date are a combination of jobs and housing, both looking at existing jobs and housing growth, and existing jobs alone, job growth, and I'll go through a summary chart that describes these. And we are also asked to describe these in the context of what we did before. Those options that had limited support so far are an allocation scenario based upon residential and non-residential build-out potential in local land use plans. I mentioned earlier that we had, through our development of our regional growth forecasts, an understanding of the potential build-out of both commercial, industrial, retail square footage by local agency throughout the county, as well as residential build-out. And what we've, but that's basically in a real long-term context, probably 20, 30 years in the future. And it was decided that wasn't an appropriate scenario because the planning period for the RENA is more short-term, 2007 to 14. We also looked at transit service. We had a discussion of this last night. We were able to identify from our travel model the total number of bus stops serving routes throughout the jurisdictions within the county and the unincorporated areas. And this reflected issues like transit accessibility. So you want to put housing closer to transit, limit impacts upon the transportation infrastructure, and it was thought that that might be an option. But there are concerns about that in terms of it might be more appropriate at a sub-local area level in which you'd like to target transit-oriented development to specific transit lines, but it loses focus in looking at a county or a jurisdiction-wide basis. We also looked at things like transit miles served, but you can have a lot of transit miles in unincorporated regions or sparsely populated regions which don't necessarily reflect transit accessibility. There wasn't a whole lot of interest among the members, with the exception of Santa Barbara, on the housing production performance issue. It was felt that that's not under the control of local agencies to any great degree. It's more a reflection of the private market public housing response. So those these allocation scenarios did not receive a lot of support by our technical committee. So this is an example of the scenarios and their impacts. At the far right-hand side is the prior allocation, looking at the 17,500 units and how that was distributed throughout the county. That the allocation was based on three factors: housing growth, jobs, and vacancy rates. The prior method was also given. Oh, I see. Okay, so thank you. So this is the prior allocation, which is the higher number, which is not our number, but just is illustrative of what we did before. We then took the same methodology and applied it to the 11,600 number. And so this is the old methodology applied to the new number. We then looked at various scenarios, starting from the simplest, existing jobs. If you take the distribution of jobs in the year 2005 across the cities and the county, unincorporated areas, by these individual regions, which are identified over here in jurisdictions, and proportionally assign the 11,600 number across those jurisdictions, this would be the result. If you took job growth, in other words, that growth in jobs that we would expect to occur within the planning period between 2007 and 2014, and used that factor to allocate job growth, that's what would be the distribution. And then the other two scenarios are kind of variations on that theme. If you had job growth and household growth over that same period, this would be the outcome. And if you had existing jobs and household growth, that's where this would play out. So we're really at the point of looking at alternatives. These do not reflect any selection by staff, by your technical planning advisory committee of SBCAG, certainly by any policy board. These are just in the test and examine phase at this point. So where we go with this next, and I can come back to that chart because I suspect you might be interested, is to look at scenarios like this that incorporates criterion weighting. For example, yesterday, the discussion that Ms. Weiss talked about, we talked about potentially separating the scenarios, partially existing jobs, partially job growth, partially housing growth, kind of a one-third, one-third, one-third allocation scenario. So they asked us to look at that. That's an example. So we'll be still looking at this over the next session, and then we'll be at the point probably fairly soon of having the committee make certain recommendations to our board for either consideration of one or more scenarios. And then I go back to the schedule I talked about earlier, in which the board then holds formal public hearings on that scenario, if they even pass it through that phase. Then they approve that draft to go out, and then you'll get the opportunity, the City Council will have a formal review opportunity for that. And I suspect I might be back here to City Council explaining that situation. Let's see. So that concludes my presentation. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Questions for Ms. Jacobs?
Thank you, Chair Myers. I remember the last round of discussion about RENA numbers, and one question that people kept asking was, well, what happens if we just say no? And is there, and I know this has been chewed on, but is there a short answer to that? Is there a fiscal liability? What happens if?
The implications would probably take a while to develop, but they're fairly draconian. If we don't prepare a regional housing needs plan, you can't certify your housing element. You can't do it alone. You cannot say this is our RENA allocation. HCD won't do it. So if our board chooses not to produce the RENA allocation, you can't have a element of in your housing element that would then enable you to certify that. Without a certified housing element, you run the risk of litigation from either developers who can't get building permits at some point in time, or others who have an interest in promotion of housing.
Okay. The second question is, at no point in this process is there an EIR or environmental considerations, in that we're asking to accommodate for the county 11,600 units, and this afternoon we had a project for 31 units, and people are demanding an EIR. So I'm wondering at what point CEQA does or does not kick in for either a specific or a programmatic EIR.
It does not kick in. It's excluded. There are factors related to consideration of farmland preservation, sewer and water to the extent that it's affected by federal and state regulations, those factors. So they're indirectly built into that, but that's it.
Okay. And one more. Some of the allocation process is based on resources that are available. For example, sewer and water. What would happen if a special district just declared an emergency? Let's say a water district said, we're out of water, we can't accommodate any more new development.
We would have to consider that in the allocation. I don't know how, but at this point in time, but that would be a factor we'd have to look at.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike, I've got three questions, probably mostly for Ms. Weiss, but Measure E expires in 2010, and as we're going through the next couple of years in this RENA process, how do we deal with that? Do we assume that Measure E will be continued after 2010? Do we make the assumption that our current rate of growth is the rate of job growth that we would see as we might factor it into the allocation process? How do we deal with that?
Chair Myers and Commissioner Thompson, Measure E is at least a package of things. When people refer to Measure E, they're talking about Charter Section 1508, which was a ballot measure, right. And it had a certain period in time in which that particular provision would sunset. The growth management policies and why, from a general plan standpoint, you would be managing and looking at how non-residential growth affects your community is also embodied in the city's land use element. So quite a bit of the charter is in the general plan, and it doesn't go away unless it's amended out of the general plan. Also, the other place where Measure E and the growth management decisions and directives are embodied is in the municipal code and the zoning ordinance. So the allocation of growth that Measure E laid out of up to 30,000 square feet of small additions per year, a maximum amount of growth that pending or approved projects could move forward with, community priority, and all the different growth factors are within the city's municipal code. So we, even though the charter per se could expire, we see a continuation of the city existing policy as certainly our current situation. The situation we are in, however, is that we are in the process of updating and examining whether or not Measure E would continue in the same fashion that it is or be restructured in any way. It was an overall 3 million square foot allocation. We have tracked the allocation and come to the Planning Commission at least once a year to monitor the growth in that program, and there still is development potential within the overall Measure E category. So that's the information that we fed into the regional growth forecast. So from a staff standpoint, we have put that forward as a continuation is our policy stance at this time. However, it is likely to change in some way or another within this RENA planning period of, 2014? Right. So the latter part of this planning period, we could have a different framework, but for now we feel pretty good about continuing with what we've got.
Is that a similar answer to my next question, and that is how do we deal with the build-out assumption of the number of units in the city that we currently have in our current housing element? We are starting to get close to that number, is that factored into the allocation process?
Well, again, this RENA allocation process is coming at a little bit of a difficult time for us because we're
Right.
embarking on the Plan Santa Barbara process where we want to look at a much longer horizon of planning standards and policies for our community, 20 years and beyond. So the 40,005 capacity analysis that's been done as part of our existing certified housing element, we fully expect that to be opened up as our housing element suggests, that as you approach the 39,000 unit number within the community, to have a full evaluation of what would the ultimate densities look like for the next 20 years. Our housing element has to incorporate RENA for a particular period, but from a general plan standpoint, you want to look at it from a longer period. So we also, as you all know, are undertaking an environmental impact report. So even though the RENA process doesn't require an environmental impact report, the city will be evaluating, let's say we receive an allocation of 2,500 units, just a round number. That number's not even on there exactly. But anyway, and given how many units are on the ground now, 2,500 could potentially put us above the 40,005. Well, we're already going to evaluate above 40,005 just in purposes of looking at, again, long-term growth possibilities within our community, and in a program EIR, that would be the prudent and responsible thing to do. So I think the city will be evaluating beyond the 40,005. So we'll have an EIR to evaluate whatever number I think the RENA process gives us, given, again, we're at like 38, what's our number? 37.5. So these numbers present certainly the same need to examine longer-term housing development as our own housing element does. So I think it'll all be considered.
Okay, well, that was a good lead into my third question, was the timeline estimate for the final allocation plan is mid-July, if no appeals. But our housing element is scheduled to be renewed by the state schedule in August of that same year, this year. So how do we plan to respond in a timely fashion if we only get our allocation mid to late July, assuming no appeals, and we have to roll out a housing element right thereafter?
Actually, I think we're off by a year. The allocation process hopefully will end sometime around August 2008.
Yep.
The HCD deadline for a new certified housing element is August 2009. But even so, that so I'm not sure if you showed that slide. I don't think Mr. Powers presented the local agency's cycle. Conclusion is actually August 09.
Okay.
But even so, that 1 year period is doesn't feel like enough time, which is I think why the Planning Commission, when you looked at the overall Plan Santa Barbara process, you said we really need to embark on these broad policy issues and the residential development scenarios for the community and the commercial development much sooner. So even though the allocation of the RENA number might not be coming, we're talking about it as part of Plan Santa Barbara much sooner. We need to. Our housing element calls for it, and our Plan Santa Barbara work program really necessitates that we, without a specific number allocated by the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, we're still going to move forward until we, and then just incorporate that number once we get it. But it'll be a range. We'll be examining a range.
We make an assumption of a range
Yes.
to use, and then we assume that we've bounded the problem.
Right, and we expect to be talking with the Planning Commission and the community about that range number as part of our Development Trends work session, so, which is in March, early April. So we have to start analyzing this sooner than the regional needs assessment process will deliver the number.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Justice?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the informative presentation, Mike. It raised a number of questions in my mind that I'll try to group together. And I'll start with this slide here. I'm wondering how this allocation table and whether it factors in the uncertified housing elements that we've got for Santa Barbara County and City of Goleta, and maybe the underproduction of units that may have arisen because of those uncertainties or community preferences to maintain the status quo, et cetera.
It's our expectation that both Goleta and Santa Barbara will be certified and have the rezonings by the time period. So it doesn't. This procedure, these scenarios do not factor that in, and I don't think we need to.
Okay. Okay. Another kind of set of questions has to do with how transfer development rights, if at all, play into this allocation piece in terms of the friendliness of agencies to different jurisdictions to accept or reject overtures to adopt some type of TDR process. And parallel to that, the basic smart growth principles of transit-oriented development, the things that, as an urban city, we're seeing a lot of versus a different jurisdiction may not have the same value set. Does that at all, can it play into this, or are we pretty much stuck with a more straightforward approach as we've got here?
We're probably oriented towards more of the straightforward approach for two reasons. I think one is that we have a board that's very diverse philosophically. Some are, I would say, very sensitive towards issues like transit-oriented development. Others are not. And part of that's reflective of the maturation of the transit system we have in our county and the urbanization that exists within our county. That's a really good question on TDR. TDR, transfer development rights, is complicated enough, but involving the RENA, aka as we have to in terms of annexations, will be a challenge. I'll have to think about that. That's an issue.
I mean, if we want to kind of advance the concept of one of the allocation factors in terms of protected and preserved lands and farmlands, that plays directly into that idea about concentrating development where you got the services and where you can make it most efficient.
It's an active policy issue between the county and the cities, and we'll bring that back to TPAC, definitely. Okay.
And the last thing does relate to the TPAC, and I guess does the TPAC get into beyond the coordination piece between agencies, is there much discussion about innovative techniques that are being used and a kind of a brain trust technique sharing, and does that slop over to the interregional issues between Western Ventura County and Southern San Luis Obispo County? We did this jobs housing report, and I'm curious, that had a lot of recommendations about trying to foster that type of collaboration, and I'm curious how that has, if it has, played out.
There has been a lot of information sharing between the local agencies. We typically have a discussion piece with every agenda in which people will share what kind of development activities occurring, what success or challenges they've had with issues like most of it is focused on mixed use, challenges related to that. So there has been that information sharing between the members. Not so much the last couple of months because we've been kind of focused on the RENA process, and that's pretty time consuming. But early last year there was that, and before. So yes, that has improved.
Do you, given that this RENA process boils down to an allocation negotiation, if you will, and that almost forces the issue of home rule, fixed pie planning, to the forefront in these types of issues. Do you have any sources of optimism of, kind of widening the pie and doing things in a more, in a bigger context of things? And
to the extent that local agencies want that, I think our board will respond accordingly. But a number of local agencies are very protective of their home rule local status and don't want regional agencies anywhere near that land use issue. And that's so far that's the message we've gotten from our board, is that we understand you have to do the RENA process. We don't like it. Question mentioned earlier, and was there thought given to not doing this? And yes, it was very seriously considered, very deliberative, the pros and cons of that. But it was believed that the risks outweighed the benefits. But our direction was to try to be pretty specific and directed at our task and not to stray too far.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming to us so early in your process.
Welcome.
Mr. Bartlett.
Chair Myers?
Yes.
Could I just add one comment along the lines of some of the questions from Commissioner Justice? I'm not sure if the Commission did review the grand jury report that was issued last year to SBCAG and all the cities and county that participate. They had a number of questions about the RENA process and the role of SBCAG in fostering regional land use planning related concerns. And so the City of Santa Barbara staff, we responded as required through a letter from the mayor and council, and we did coordinate with the SBCAG staff a bit on some of those responses. There was an interest along these lines of how much regional discussion takes place in the SBCAG process, and I think behind that was a desire to see more of it. And again, I think the TPAC discussion that I observed in the two meetings that I've been to kind of goes in and out. Planners, they'll get together and they'll start asking questions that broaden the perspective, and then maybe somebody will go, oh, but what does that mean to my number? And then the perspective starts to come back down, and then it goes back out. It's kind of interesting. So along those lines, one of the questions that came up in the grand jury was this performance issue, and I did want to mention that because it was discussed last night, and we said we wanted to reserve a little bit of our concluding statement on that, knowing that we'd have the opportunity at least to talk with you about it a bit. So the idea was presumably that agencies that are performing, that are producing housing in the various housing types, again, might somehow be acknowledged for that. And I guess presumably on the other side you might say underperforming regions might be penalized in effect and be allocated more units. Now, I don't think that necessarily makes sense. And again, what the City of Santa Barbara responded in the grand jury report is, just like all the agencies, again, the RENA process is not about production, it's about zoning capacity. So people kept giving the same rote, technically correct answer. And then we also, again, continued to promote how, pride in the city's production of housing. But I think there has been a concern about really linking those two. So that's why last night at the TPAC, all those present said, well, they didn't think it should be a factor. And we just said, well, at least if it was going to possibly be a beneficial nod to communities that are producing housing, that could be a benefit to the City of Santa Barbara. But I do think it would be really a tough negotiated factor and not necessarily truly in line with what the RENA procedure is about. It is about planning for the next planning and increment period. So I don't really see a lot of hope that would continue into being a seriously weighted factor. But I would love to hear any comments that you have on that.
Yeah, it just seems that there's not a wealth of flexibility when it comes to taking a top-down process that Mr. Powers has been tasked with, and making it, work in an elegant way. It's just real hard work. But when you think about TDRs, and if you're transferring development rights from, say, Gaviota into Santa Barbara, say, the Funk Zone or someplace like that, where it could work. Maybe there's a way to get extra credit for accepting density in terms of the RENA process, where if you accept three units of density that go in some portion of the city, then you get 5 units of credit when it comes to the RENA process, because you're taking that density and putting it in a place that's better able to accommodate it than farmland west of Goleta.
And on the TEDR, the city has participated in the current county study that's being undertaken. I think, again, without a policy action or directive from the council, even though it's interesting, I think it would not be too likely to see this particular group say, we're going to put that in as a 2%, 5%, or 10% factor, because the Board of Supervisors and the City Council haven't actually said we're doing that beyond studying what are the feasibility, what's the feasibility and economics of a TEDR program. So I love the discussion, but like you say, when it comes right down to it and they actually have to put the numbers out there, they're going to rely on the forecast model probably to a very large degree.
Chair Myers, members of the commission, just one further clarification on the performance measures. If you'll recall, over the last couple of years at the state level, there's been a lot of discussion about the RENA process, housing elements, how they can be certified. There's a lot of discussion about opting out. And one of the proposals that has been made is to use performance standards of how well a jurisdiction's done in terms of building and meeting their allocation as one means to not have to go through the very rigorous and onerous, some people might argue, HCD certification process. So that's one way it's been looked at, not necessarily in terms of allocating your number, but in terms of getting you certified and forcing you to go through HCD.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was a great lead-in to my question. How did we perform in the prior allocation period, both in production and zoning to allow for units to be built?
The zoning, there wasn't a problem. We were able to easily demonstrate that we had the zoning capacity to meet our number of 2,330, and again, that was mostly found in the downtown, through our mixed use zoning. In terms of the breakouts, I do think I have that. If you just give me a minute here, I think I can find it.
Okay, that'd be great.
I have a quick question for Mr. Powers when you're looking for that. I'm looking at this carry forward of prior allocations, and I'm wondering how often can that occur? I mean, can you carry forward from year to year to year to year and not be penalized or not come under some added scrutiny?
We start a new process each cycle, so if you use some of that capacity within the intervening period and you're assigned a share more than that capacity remaining, you'd have to create, new zoning opportunities. Or maybe I'm not following the question.
I think you are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chair Myers and Commissioner Bartlett, what we have here is out of the total allocation of 2,333, what we have built or approved are 770 total units. And that breaks down, unfortunately I don't have the percentages for you, but for example, on low income, out of the 397 that we were allocated, we built 334. So as you know, that's one area where we're really heavy hitters in terms of building our very low income, and we have almost 12% of permanently affordable housing. Now, the next two areas, it's a little bit fuzzy. We know that there's a typo here, and Betty, Ms. Weiss was pointing out to me that 770 built or approved units is correct, but in terms of moderate income and above moderate, we're showing 0 above moderate income. Well, we know we've built more than that. But what it does show is that for our allocation of moderate income for 397, we have built 436.
That 436 number is incorrect. I think we've tried to correct this chart a couple of times.
Which chart are you on?
Is it in the staff report?
What does it look like?
It's page 8 of, after all these long tables with the different methodology, then there's another little table that says 2001 to 2008 regional housing needs assessment. And there's 2 boxes. Looks like this.
I don't think they've done.
But in any event, unfortunately, we have commented that this breakdown is not correct. But the total number of units of 770 during that same allocation period where we were allocated the 2,300. But again, they're really apples to oranges. We didn't downzone. We still have the capacity for the 23.
We just did our jobs.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as you'll recall, too, that twice a year we come with the Measure E update, and we give you the housing, and typically that we have been, for over the last 10 years, been building between 100 and 120 units a year. So the 770 number is correct.
And then my second question then is actually for Mr. Powers. So I'm assuming then that Ventura has a 0 allocation to house our workers, since we have a county line running between us?
It wouldn't have a 0 allocation because they would have gotten an allocation from their counterpart regional agency, which is the Southern California Association of Governments. I don't know what that allocation refers to, but it would reflect some element of growth in Ventura, Oxnard, and in general, all cities in the unincorporated area within western Ventura County.
Even though they work here?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. We have a member of the public that wishes to speak, Kathy McCammon.
Yes, I'm Kathy
Could you?
McCammon.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, first of all, I think in terms of the question on the information gathering, we weren't able to have anybody go to the meeting last night, but one thing we would like to see is to get the employers to poll employees as to what kind and price of housing do they want. This would relate to their general employees, but also should be included maybe a section on what we keep calling the first responders, because there seems to be a great gap between the kind of housing we have, which, as we have seen in, like, even maybe not so much the project today, but the smaller condos going for $600,000 on up, versus do people want a house with a yard, and are they wanting to commute to have that? I think that's one thing we need to know to kind of inform all of our discussions. Then the other point is that affordable housing can be built with the proposed lower height limits. Maybe the smaller units will be cheaper, more affordable, and more sustainable. The current taller buildings we're seeing aren't, and apparently can't, according to the developers, produce the affordable housing we need. When we talk about a jobs housing balance, we have a tremendous number of low-paying retail and other service employees that can't afford any of the housing that's being produced by the private sector here. They probably need apartments, and very few apartments. I think there's one project going into Goleta, but very few apartments are being produced, period. And then, of course, the question of how do we balance our limited build-out with the continued demands of RENA. So those are our comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments from the commission? Ms. Jacobs?
Thank you, Chair Myers. This is a question, and then are we going to go to comments? Okay.
You can.
I do have a question about rental units. The majority of our population are renters in the city of Santa Barbara. Do rental units count the same as ownership units? They do?
Yes. The RENA process doesn't differentiate other than by income group. But then it's the local, again, what the local housing element process and then the local development activity produces.
Okay. And then a corollary to that is, as planning professionals, our staff is planning for growth, but we have right now 0 to less population growth. We have population decline. What is the, how does that factor in?
That does factor in, Mr. Powers.
We do look at that as part of our regional growth forecast, and we had quite a bit of tension with HCD on this issue. They were arguing a lot of our growth is going to be from smaller households associated with the retirement population, both in migration and other factors. So even though we're seeing a change in the age structure of the population, an older population, they still argued strenuously for housing demand, and that's why their estimate of household formation and household demand is considerably higher than our estimate of what might take place.
Okay, so it would affect us if we were perhaps judged on performance on a particular issue. I mean, we have the zoning to accommodate units for growth, but our experience is our population is not actually growing. If anything, it's going the other way, particularly in the rental community, which must choose increasingly to live outside of the city's limits. Okay. And then I just have one primary comment. Is our recommendation from the Commission to the TPAC or to SBCAG? Who are we sending this off to?
I think it's mostly directed to the planning staff. As a member of the TPAC, your comments and questions will help, again, foster our thoughts and what we add into that process. And then, again, I think it helps SBCAG staff as well. That's the intent. And then there will be a formal review at a later point where you can weigh in on, what was decided and the effects. But I think it's beneficial to both at this time.
Okay, so we're just sounding off in general. The factor slide shows the factors being weighed as jobs and housing, but a third and equally important element is missing to my thinking, and no one knows it better than SBCAG because that third element is transportation. Our transit capacity is a very limited resource in the city of Santa Barbara. I expect if we did an EIR, that would be one of the impacts that we would discover. And SBCAG can support the South County, in particular the Santa Barbara jobs housing imbalance, by actively supporting alternative transportation and rail transportation, such as was presented to a lukewarm reception, I might add, to SBCAG earlier this week. My thinking is that traffic capacity and transit must be a factor in the allocation.
Thank you. Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to go from real broad to a lot more narrow, it reminds me about an accordion. That number 37,500 obviously doesn't count unpermitted housing. It doesn't count room rentals. Does it count retirement community units? people who need caregivers in their home, things like this that obviously we're providing housing in our existing area already. So I'm just looking for ways that the count is accurate so that we actually may be absorbing more than we're counting. Just because we have this invisible population, or, you know, I don't want anything left out. For instance, retirement units. We have expansion of Valle Verde, for instance. I don't know if those were counted so.
No, I think those would be counted. I think you're probably a little more, I think the illegal unit issue is probably.
I'm throwing it all in there because, I want
It's typically counted as group quarters, and they typically count them as beds. You count number of beds, that kind of thing.
That's correct.
But not the converted garages.
And those lovely pool cabanas, I mean, there's some nice alternative housing out there. And, I'm just, we may be able to meet goals in some non-traditional way.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much. I'd like to underscore Ms. Jacobs' concerns and about traffic, the inclusion of that. It's certainly, the regional aspect of this is so important. And what we take on what the South takes on from us, and what we take on in our housing in that regard, I think is really important. So that balance of jobs, housing, and transit, I think is critical.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll look forward to what you bring next. Mr. Ledbetter, did you have something else?
Yeah, I just thought it might be useful. Last night, the TPAC did discuss the issue of transit, and that was actually one of the options, the factors they took off the table. So maybe Mr. Powers could enlighten us a little bit as to how that discussion went.
We did, they asked us at a prior meeting to examine transit as an allocation criteria. Remember when I summarized the actions by other agencies, such as the Association of Bay Area Governments, they included transit as an allocation factor, a small one, and it was related to employment or housing near transit centers. We did look at, as part of our travel model, we looked at it in terms of number of bus stops by routes, by jurisdiction, and transit mileage by jurisdiction. Transit mileage didn't work too well because you can have a lot of miles without any stops when you're going past undeveloped areas. So didn't have a lot of application to the unincorporated area situation. We also looked at interregional transit services such as the Vista service that comes up from Ventura Coastal Express and the Clean Air Express from North County. The issue with that, for example, we do have Clean Air Express service from Lompoc to Santa Barbara. However, there's basically one pickup point in Lompoc, and you could be a resident of either the city or the unincorporated area and take that service. We really don't know the difference between the riders in that context. So that would be hard to use that criteria in terms of assigning a number of units between a city and an unincorporated area. The one that had the most potential was bus stops by route. So for areas like the Outer State Street Hollister corridor, where you have multiple routes going along those corridors, we'd identify all the stops associated with each route and then assign those to the jurisdictions which they're which they're in, and that reflects to a certain extent transit accessibility. The concern that was evident among the members: do you reduce or increase an allocation based upon that? If you want to focus on transit-oriented development, you'd want to add units to those areas that had the most transit service. If that was your objective in mind. And so that got to be problematic for some of the jurisdictions like Santa Barbara that had lots of transit service. you might be put in a position of adding additional service. Second issue was that folks who are familiar with the Bay Area indicated that, their levels of transit service with sophisticated commuter rail, populations in the region over 1 million, you have a different level of transit service and accessibility than you do in areas that are more mature but smaller, and also those areas that are growing and haven't had that much development in terms of their transit system. So the situation we have countywide is somewhat different than the Bay Area. But I think based on those considerations, the majority of the membership did not favor incorporation of the criteria within the allocation scenarios.
Again, I think it goes back to how clearly articulated and supported are these issues from a regional standpoint, and on the transfer of development rights, the on-track, those things. When we see the local elected officials talking about certain things but not necessarily saying this is our direction and here's how we're going to get there, I think it's difficult for at the staff level then to in effect be making policy by allocating a weighting factor to something like transit. It's a little bit difficult. However, I will say too, what I learned last night was that in the Bay Area, I guess their discussion, it started like, let's make this a big factor. What was it, like 40 or something? And then it was down to, somehow got down to 10, and then somehow got down to what?
Yeah, it's 5 apiece. Yeah.
5. So, here, if it, I just don't know if what will end up happening is at least let the records show that it was put out there and we looked at it, and it may just not show up as a 0.01 factor or something.
Ms. Jacobs?
I really had kind of a two-part thought on it. The first you've addressed. The second part has to do with traffic capacity. Traffic capacity is a resource just like water, and we sometimes forget that there's a limit to how much of it we have. We don't forget that we have limits on water, but we forget that we have limits on our traffic capacity, and we do. And Santa Barbara in particular is squeezing and squeezing its traffic capacity to the point where the public is annoyed, and probably will become more so as time goes on. And one of the ways we deal with a water shortage would be to conserve water. One of the ways we would deal with a traffic capacity shortage is to conserve traffic capacity by using alternate transportation, and in particular intercity or regional transportation of the kind that SBCAG allocates money for. So I'm thinking more of the resource of traffic capacity in the city of Santa Barbara and how it limits our ability to increase our development unit numbers.
Mr. Jostis?
Just as a last comment, I just know that Mr. Powers is kind of like the senior staff to the UN, because this whole regional planning issue, it's dealing with a bunch of tribes that have very strong feelings about what goes on in their territories. And collaboration is not a natural act when it comes to this type of planning process. So I wish you the best of luck on this one, Mike.
Thank you. Well, with that, we'll say thanks again and good luck. So this will move us on to our administrative agenda, which I think we can get through quickly. We have committee and liaison reports. Ms. Jacobs.
This is not a full report, but rather just a compliment to the Commission for turning out to the Creating a Healthy Community Forum. I think everyone was there, and hopefully the public at large will continue to attend these. I think there was about 120 people that attended. Hope they all come back for the next one, and that we get some participation in this general plan forum process.
Thank you for bringing that up. I agree. Ms. Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I attended the HLC meeting yesterday. However, I had to leave for the presentation of St. Francis. So I'll defer to my alternate to provide any information regarding that project. Thanks.
Thank you. I did watch it until, I wasn't able to attend in person, but I did watch it until the city shifted from the HLC to the Public Works Commission right in the middle of the project. So I was really sorry not to get some of the reaction from the commission. The project is going through changes, and the public had comment regarding those changes, and that's really all I can really offer on it. I will be getting minutes from the HLC, and perhaps I can provide a little bit more next time. I'll also say that the Plan Santa Barbara Commission Subcommittee met, and progress is being made there that we'll look forward to in the near future. I want to bring it up for the sole purpose of recognizing Commissioner Jostis's work for that meeting. The city is well served by having someone like Mr. Jostis on this commission, and it was no more evident than in that meeting. He brought forward some really good ideas that I think, in great detail, that I think will push our process forward in a fine manner. So with that, we can move on to review of the decision of the staff hearing officer. Anything there? Nothing there. I have one more thing. An announcement. In addition to being able to watch today's hearing live on your computer, beginning on Monday, you'll be able to access today's Planning Commission hearing in the meeting archives on the PC site. That site is santabarbaraca.gov/PC. You'll need high-speed internet access in order to view those videos.
Just like we do for City Council, you're able to go back and watch old meetings. So that's the new change.
So with that, we are adjourned. Good night.